morning, everybody. We'll start the day. And good morning, Mr. Maxwell. I don't know, how do you pronounce your name? Maxwell, so I said it right. So you have a declaration as expert. If you kindly read it to us. Excuse me, sir. Press the button. And press the button. That's right.
Good now?
Mr.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. President, before we begin, we were sent two so-called demonstrative exhibits last night by the counsel for the claimant. I think the intention was to use them in today's testimony. One of them, I think, relates to Mr. McSwain. The other one, I'm not quite sure which witness is going to use it. I just wanted to say that with respect to one of the exhibits, just called the McSwain rebuttal, I guess we were able to check the data points, and they seem to be okay. They seem to be using data points that are in the record already. But with respect to another one, with respect to Iowa Interstate Railroad, EBITDA, I think we have some very strong objections to its use. We have no way of verifying this chart. You'll recall that the financials we received for RDC were almost completely blacked out, and we think that this one should not be used because the data is not in the record and we don't know how we can possibly check this. So I just wanted to raise that before we begin the testimony today.
Mr. Foster.
I won't use the one that they objected to without it. There we go. Thank you. I won't use the one they've objected to without first allowing them to present their objection and the panel ruling on it.
Thank you, Mr. Foster. Then, Mr. McSwain, we will proceed with your declaration as an expert.
I solemnly declare upon my honor and conscience that my statement will be in accordance with my sincere belief.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Stan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Mr. McSwain.
Good morning.
Do you have in front of you copies of the two expert reports you have submitted in this arbitration dated May 18th, 2009 and March 15th, 2011?
I do.
Okay, and do you ratify each of these reports and affirm their truthfulness before the tribunal?
I do.
Mr. McSwain, what expert analysis were you asked to perform in this case?
I was asked to opine and assess the revenue that could be generated on the railways, rights of way and commercial yards and leases with regard to real estate.
And are you referring to the revenues that would have been generated by Ferrovias?
Yes.
Could you please describe to the tribunal some of your background and experience in valuing and leasing railroad real estate?
Certainly. I've been in real estate since 1967, but for the last 25 years, I basically have been involved with railroad real estate. I was former senior vice president of Guilford Transportation, who owned 3 railroads, the Delaware and Hudson, the Boston and Maine, and the Maine Central Railroad. I was in charge of their real estate operations. I then formed my own company as a consultant for railroads and railroad real estate, and some of my clients were CSX, Union Pacific, Illinois Central, Florida East Coast Railway, New York Transit Authority, and others. And then in my remainder of my career, I spent 7 to 8 years as vice chairman of Florida East Coast Industries, who owned Florida East Coast Railway, and I was also president of company called Flagler Development Company, which was owned by Florida East Coast Industries and the railway. And as president, we developed approximately 6.5 million square feet of office, showroom, and industrial real estate in the state of Florida, and the great bulk of that was actually developed on railway-owned real estate.
Thank you. Now, to help illustrate your testimony analysis, you put up on the screen the demonstrative exhibit. They should have it. Can you explain what this chart shows?
Yes, sir. There's three components to it. One component is the existing agreements that the railroad had, and also the Cobigua lease and some short-term rentals. That is in the, I think, I'm partially colorblind, but I think it's in the green. Then the red is the right-of-way leases that existed and then was projected as for the remaining 42 years remaining on the agreement. And the other was the yards and railroad real estate that was not necessarily right-of-way and also projected over the remaining 42 years of the agreement with regard to revenue.
And the projections that are shown here on this chart here, do these come from, which report does that come from in your submissions?
This comes from the second rebuttal,
Now,
second report.
Now, regarding the first component of your analysis and projections, the revenues FEG would have earned from its pre-existing right-of-way property leases and short-term rentals. Does the respondent's damages expert, Dr. Spiller, accept your projections?
He does. I think we're in agreement with regard to this one.
Okay, now regarding the second line, the red line on the demonstrative, the revenues you project FVG would have earned from additional right-of-way leases. Is it your opinion that your projections are reasonably certain?
Yes, sir.
Okay, please explain to the tribunal the basis for your opinion.
Well, there's probably four components to that. One would be 25 years or so of executing these kind of agreements with the railroad and railroads. Whether they be transmission, fiber optic, gas lines, etc. I've done dozens of these during my career. Secondly, there was existing agreements that had been in place with the Ferrovias and the railway, and they have been negotiated by the railroad. Thirdly, there was a contract that was about to be executed with Gesur, and that was about to be done at $3,200 a mile, and for I think 32 kilometers, I'm sorry. And that agreement was about to be done, but there was a Lesivo decree which caused the transaction not to be completed. And then I think the most accurate of all is the looking at the right-of-way that we have industrial squatters on the right-of-way that have virtually filled the right-of-way, and I think that I asked Mr. Sen to, after the completion of my report, to virtually look at the entire right-of-way, both main line and spur lines, to see if there were any squatters on it that was longitudinally, which would be, for the most part in this instance, electrical easements.
Okay, let's go to Annex 1 of your rebuttal report. Can you describe what this map illustrates?
Yes, those are the main line and the spur lines through the entire railway rights-of-way, and it shows that virtually the entire rights-of-way are now presently occupied by industrial squatters and power lines.
Now, does respondent's expert, Dr. Spiller, disagree with your projections of the additional easements that Ferrovias would have obtained in the absence of the Lesivo resolution?
Yes, he does.
Okay. What is your understanding of Dr. Spiller's opinion in that regard?
Well, it's difficult to understand as you look at this map and the illustration. They're all over the right-of-way, virtually entire right-of-way, and therefore it would be hard to believe that those would not have been legalized and then monetized by the railway if the decree had not occurred.
Okay, now let's talk briefly about your projections of the revenues from the additional station and station yard leases Ferrovias would have obtained in the absence of the Lesivo resolution. Is it your opinion that your projections are reasonably certain?
Yes, sir.
And can you please explain the basis for your opinion?
Well, I think there's three components to that question. One would be the location of these properties. As you look at the map, you'll notice that the rights-of-way run right through the central areas of the communities of Guatemala. And this is where people live and work. And you'd be hard-pressed to find more centralized locations than those that this railway runs through. Two, we had some action, I guess, with some companies with regard to certain locations, and one would be Garona. Garona was an area that we could have probably immediately started to develop a parking lot. That did not occur because of the Lesivo Act. We had activity with Una Super, I think it's called, which is a supermarket chain that was interested in doing a venture development with the railway in Zacapa and I think 3 or 4 other locations. And when you look at the analysis that I did, I believe they were highly conservative. I used delayed start dates, high vacancy rates, virtually no inflationary movement in most of the properties, no increase in rents, a 10% return on real estate, which is a very normal return for any land lease investment. And so I feel pretty comfortable that I don't understand how Dr. Spiller can in fact say that for the next 42 years that there would be no value to the real estate that is so centrally located in these communities.
Thank you, Mr. McSwain. I have no further questions.
Mr. De Bois?
Good morning, Mr. McSwain.
Morning, sir.
My name is Whitney Debevoise, and I represent Guatemala in this proceeding.
Yes,
and I'll
sir.
be asking you some questions about your reports.
Yep.
You talked a little bit about your background. I guess you spent nearly 20 years or half of your employed career with the Hartford Insurance Group doing domestic U.S. real estate development on large downtown office buildings, golf resorts, suburban office parks, and planned communities. Is that right?
That is correct, sir.
And that doesn't sound very much like Guatemala, does it?
Well, I think if I can answer, I think real estate development is real estate development.
Then for 5 or 6 years you were with Guilford Transportation Industries, which runs railroads in New England in the United States, correct?
Yes, sir.
And while you were there, you negotiated several fiber optic right-of-way leasing transactions with big companies like AT&T, Sprint, and MCI. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Have you seen any reference in the record in this case to big telecommunication companies like AT&T in Guatemala?
No, I have not, but I have seen electrical transmissions, which is the same basic thing that is a longitudinal transaction on a right-of-way.
Yeah, well, we were talking about telecommunications there with
Okay.
my question. Then you founded a consulting company where you spent a decade and you worked for clients in the railroad and telecommunications industries. This time with some clients in the Chicago area and Canada and Florida. Is that right?
That is correct, sir.
Oh, and again, I see you were involved with AT&T and NYNEX, the big Bell companies, right?
That is correct, sir.
Okay.
Mr. David Weiss, for purposes of the interpretation, can you slow down just a little bit? Thank you.
Then in 1999, about the time that the Guatemalan Railroad was restarting service, you served as vice chairman of Florida East Coast Industries, the holding company for the Florida East Coast Railroad, right?
Yes, and the holding company for
And when you were vice chairman,
Excuse me. Please wait to question the expert that he has finished, and vice versa. And that the expert to reply
Yes, sir.
that the question had been asked.
And when you were vice chairman, approximately how many tons of freight a year did Florida East Coast Railway ship?
I frankly had nothing to do with the railway operation, so I don't know.
But it was probably in the millions, correct?
I can't answer that. I don't know.
Okay. While you worked in Florida, and I assume you lived in Florida while you worked there, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And you also served as president of Grand Central Corporation, or is it Grand? I'm not sure. The report said Grand.
Believe it or not, it's without the D. It's
Without the
Grand.
D, okay, thank you. And then you retired and performed consulting assignments such as the one you're doing for RDC, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. McSwain, after all this time in the railroad business, you kind of like railroads, don't you?
I like the real estate with railroads.
Okay. Would you say, though, you're a bit of an enthusiast about railroads?
No, I'm enthusiastic about
Real estate. Okay. Have you ever consulted for RDC before?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, you were asked to assess and opine on the reasonably expected returns on the exclusive leasing and development rights for the Ferrovías right-of-way, station and station yard real estate assets that were granted to Ferrovías as of the time immediately prior to the issuance of the Lesivo resolution in August 2006. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So your job was to calculate the reasonably expected revenue stream of real estate business associated with assets granted in this usufruct, correct?
Correct.
That was a grant under Contract 402, as to which Guatemala has taken no action, correct? That's not an issue in this case, 402.
I have no idea what 402 is, so I don't know.
I think in your first report you said that you had reviewed Contract 402.
Where did I say that?
Let me direct you to that. If you look, sir, on page 2 of your report in paragraph 3.1.
You are correct. I stand corrected.
Okay, thank you. And you conducted your analysis as of the time of the Lesivo Declaration in August 2006, is that right?
I think that's when I was there. Yes.
Well, I was
that
asking
correct?
about the analysis, not when you were there.
Oh.
In other words, you were trying to establish these future flows as of August 2006, right? The time of the Lesivo declaration.
I have to say that I'm not exactly sure about August 2006.
I see. All right. So another way of putting this is that you were asked to ascertain what results a potential willing buyer of this real estate usufruct would have projected, right? That was basically your task as set forth in 1.1 of your statement.
Yep,
That objection to, I think that mischaracterizes his report.
Could the witness please read 1.1 of his first statement?
1.1 says, "My name is Robert F. McSwain. I've been asked by Claimant Railroad Development RDC to assess,
Mr. McSwain, can you slow
oh,
down
I'm sorry.
for the record? Thank you.
to assess and opine on what were the reasonably expected returns on the exclusive leasing and development rights for the right-of-way, station, and station yard real estate assets that were granted to RDC's investment enterprise, Ferrovias Guatemala, FVG, by the government of Guatemala pursuant to a 50-year onerous usufruct, the usufruct, as of the time immediately prior to the issuance of the government's Lesivo resolution in August 2006.
Thank you. And a few minutes ago, you said you weren't quite sure whether you actually did it as of August 2006. Is that right?
Excuse, before you reply, I think Professor Crawford has a question, comment.
It's not a question. We're dealing with experts now. I don't think we need the same sort of intervention from counsel as we've had with fact witnesses. Mr. McSwain is quite capable of looking after himself.
Thank you, Professor Crawford. Mr. McSwain, when were you retained in this matter?
I cannot give you an exact date. I don't know the answer to that.
Can you give me an approximate time when you were approached and asked to take on this assignment?
I would say that it had to be sometime in 2006,
You have
prior to my visit to Guatemala, so it had to be in 2006.
Okay, thank you. And after you were retained, in order to conduct a willing buyer analysis, you did some investigations. You described those in Section 3 of your first report. And I think you state there that you reviewed the business plan that Ferrovias prepared and submitted in support of its winning bid on the usufruct, right?
Let me just read it for a second. Yes.
Okay. And the business plan was presented in 1997 when Ferrovias made the bid, correct?
I don't know whether it was 1997 or not.
Okay. But did you find the business plan useful on the subject of real estate?
Only that it gave them the right to do it.
Did it contain any projections about what type of income they might receive?
Not that I saw.
Okay, thank you. And as we mentioned a minute ago, you also reviewed the usufruct contract itself. And I'm sure that when you did, you noticed the provisions in Clause 13, C22, that break the task of rehabilitating the railway system into 5 phases. I think they're going to put this up for you, sir.
Okay.
This is C22 for the record. And could we have Clause 13, please? And could we focus, please? Yes. All right, and I think when you reviewed this clause 13, one of the things you probably noticed was that there's a rough timetable associated with each one of the phases for the rehabilitation. Is that right? You see where it links phase 2 is supposed to begin 3 years after the effectiveness of deed 402?
I see what it says,
Right, that's what it says, right? Okay,
seemingly so,
right.
yes.
And the agreement became effective on May 23, 1998, so 3 years later would have been May of 2001, right?
Yes.
And the time associated with Phase 3 is 5 years after effectiveness, so that would have been 2003, right?
It seems what the math is doing,
Right.
yes.
And the time for Phase 4 is 10 years after effectiveness, so 2008.
Okay,
And the time for Phase 5 is 15 years after, so that would have been 2013.
okay.
Okay. And according to, well, let me take that back. From the contract, therefore, it was clear, well, excuse me, let's move forward to clause 16 of the contract. 16.2. You see that underlined language in 16.2? It's in the bottom half here. Could you just read that underlined language, please?
The use of Ruck's failure to begin railway restoration and failure to render cargo transportation services under the terms of Section 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 of the 13th clause of this contract. In the event that the usufructuary fails to restore the railway and fails to render cargo transportation. Do I keep going, or just
No, I think you've caught the essence of it.
what exactly?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry, excuse me. Could we just scroll down, please, to clause 4? I'm sorry, it's clause 19, no? Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. So, yes. So keep going then, please.
Where am I now?
Okay. Start there with of the 13th clause, where you were, I think.
Could I make a comment before I read on, please?
Sure.
I'm not quite sure exactly what this has to do with my analysis of real estate. This seems to be a legal matter that would be handled by the lawyers and not by a real estate person. I look at being asked to value the real estate, and the legal people have to figure out whether or not the real estate belongs to them or not. That is not under my assignment to do, and that's why I'm having problem doing this.
Okay, I appreciate that, Mr. McSwain. But the language here says that the real property where the railway has yet to be restored would have to be returned to Guatemala or to Fegua.
Objection. Asking for a legal interpretation and conclusion, because the witness is not a lawyer. He's, as he's already stated, he's not here to testify on interpretation of legal documents.
And I'm not asking him to interpret it, I'm just asking him what it says. The contract clearly says that under certain circumstances, the real estate might have to be returned. And I'm not saying that that condition exists today. I'm just saying that that's what the contract says.
I mean, I think the contract speaks for itself.
Okay, we'll admit that. The contract speaks for itself. And you assumed in your analysis that there would be real estate revenues from all phases of this usufruct, right? All 800 kilometers.
Before the expert replies on the objection that had been raised, I think the expert is not pronouncing himself on the clause of the contract, but should answer assuming that what counsel is explaining is correct.
Okay, and yes, I will agree. What I was trying to say, obviously poorly, was that I was going to analyze all of the real estate, and the legal people could figure out whether the real estate should or should not have been analyzed and valued and was able to be leased. For example, if there is no rail on a right-of-way at all, and there's no trains running on a right-of-way, it makes it even easier for electrical transmission and other people to use that right-of-way. And I was valuing it as something that they would use.
Thank you, Mr. McSwain. And according to Mr. Thompson's first report, Ferrovias would only develop the Atlantic corridor. If we look at paragraph 57 of Mr. Thompson's report.
I will, but I did not read Mr. Thompson's report.
Okay. Mr. Thompson said that in his report, yet you assumed in doing your work that you were doing evaluation on the entire usufruct. So you were assuming that the full amount would always be available for 42 years, correct?
That was the basis of my evaluation, yes.
Okay. Yet we saw that in the contract, if Ferrovias did not build out the system, they might have to surrender portions. And you said you would depend on a lawyer to tell you that.
I repeat that was a decision that lawyers would have to handle, but I was going to evaluate it as if that was an entire right-of-way.
Okay. And did you take any look at the financial statements for Ferrovias to see whether they had any leasing income during the time that they were operating in Guatemala?
Yes.
All right. And could we please put up C27H, FVG's annual report for 2005, specifically Note 19 to the financial statements, which is on page 18 of the English version. Page 18, please. There's English and Spanish in there, but if you get back to the very back, you'll find the financials and the notes to the financials. Note 19.
Page 18, note 19.
Right.
I think I'm on the wrong one here.
Okay, there we go. Did you find the right one? Exhibit number C27H. Scroll it down a little bit more. I need to see that farther up the page. Thank you. you located it, sir?
No, but I'm going to look on the sheet here.
Okay,
Exactly
very
what
good.
portion are you at?
Okay. Do you see there, about a third of the way down, where it says the sanctions for the usufructuary specified in the contract are the following?
Yes.
Okay. And could you read item A under that entry?
For not rehabilitating the railway line and not offering the provision of service for the transportation of cargo must return to FEGWA the properties which is located in that line that was not rehabilitated.
Okay. And could you read item C, please?
For non-compliance with the technical and economic proposal, the contract will be terminated and indemnity paid to the state for lack of railway service. And again, I repeat, this was not my assignment. My assignment was to value the real estate.
But you did say you looked at the financials, and notwithstanding this warning in the financials, you didn't consult anyone to get any view on whether this was a reasonable probability or not, did you?
I was asked to value the real estate.
Okay, sir.
I valued the real estate.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what you did do. You stated in your first report that from August 12 to August 19, you personally went to Guatemala as part of your diligence, right?
That is correct.
Okay. And do you recall how far in advance of that trip you were retained for this assignment?
I don't recall exactly how far in advance I was.
Did you do some work on the assignment before you went to Guatemala?
Oh, I looked at some stuff and certainly had many phone conversations.
I see. But you based a large part of your report on that trip that you made in August of 2007, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. Was this the first time you ever went to Guatemala?
Yes.
Have you been back since?
No.
Okay. You said that while you were there, you personally toured and inspected the entire FVG right-of-way in Guatemala, correct?
Yes.
So you covered 800 kilometers in 1 week.
Actually, I did. That is a misstatement on my part. I did not get over to the Mexico side.
What do you mean by the Mexico side? You didn't look at the southern line at all?
I looked at part of the southern line, but I did not look at it as I went all the way over to, I can't even remember what the connection is in Mexico.
I see. Okay. So you didn't look at the Tecla Uman station?
That's the one I'm talking, yes.
The Tecla Uman station.
That is correct.
And while on the tour, you said that you had discussions with various local developers, potential Ferrovias investors, and customers from 2006, as well as local financial institutions and real estate professionals, right?
That's correct.
Okay. In total, about how many people did you speak to?
I couldn't tell you in total at all, but there certainly was telephone conversations with bankers, and I think those are listed on my annex to my report, and also conversations I had with others, which is also listed in my annex to my report.
So the people that you spoke with are listed in your report?
The people that I spoke with are listed in the annex to my
Yes.
report, I think.
Okay. I think that's number 2 to your report, correct?
Yes.
Okay, Exhibit 2. All right. Are you familiar with the community of real estate professionals in Guatemala?
No.
Okay. And the people you spoke to, were they people that Ferrovias suggested you talk to?
That would be the only source other than the answer to that would be yes.
Okay, thank you.
They were the people that Ferrovias had dealt with.
Okay. In Exhibit 2 to your first report, you refer to conversations with Mr. Alejandro Ariola, Juan Antonio Azurdia, Diego Castillo, Gustavo Ariola, and Juan Pablo Oslager.
Conversations, yes.
Do you remember the names of any other people with whom you met while in Guatemala, other than Ferrovias personnel?
No, I was pretty busy while I was running around, so I don't remember the names, no.
Okay. But they weren't important enough to put in your report.
I don't understand what that question means. What do you mean?
The names of the other people, the sources that you spoke to, were not considered important enough by you to list them in the report. You could have put an annex in and said, I spoke to X, Y, Z, etc., but you listed 5 people.
I listed 5 people who are developers, and one of them was a real estate broker, and it represented Korean investors, bankers. What I don't understand where you're going. I talk to people who are in the business.
Okay. And who is Gustavo Ariola?
Let me find it. He was a person that was interested in the Garona station parking lot.
Okay. And Mr. McSwain, you expressed some opinions about a long list of properties, 20-some-odd properties. Did you meet anyone who had specific knowledge about the real estate market in Chuquimula?
I think that Mr. Azurdia did.
I see. What about Impala?
I can't remember whether he did or he didn't.
What about Amatitlan?
You mean all the properties that I gave very low value to? Is that what you're referencing? Because they're not prominent locations? Is that? I don't understand where you're going, so I'm more than happy to
I
answer your
just
question.
asked you a simple question. I'm trying to find out how you learned about these different properties that you listed and valued.
Because you would talk to people like Mr. Azurdia and actually talk to other real estate people that I have mentioned in here.
Okay. If we look at your first statement, and we look, for example, at item E on page 12 of your first statement, you're talking about Zacapa.
Yes?
Okay. And at the end of the third sentence, you said that this would be perfect for intermodal traffic.
Yes?
Okay. Would your opinion about that change if I told you that in the course of these proceedings we had a witness who moved containers for Ferrovias from a point right next to their station in Guatemala City, and he said that the volume of containers he was handling was maybe 60 or 80 containers a week?
Would my opinion change?
Would
No.
your opinion about the value of this real estate
I have
change?
no idea who the person was. I can't. I never heard what he had to say, and you're now telling me what he had to say. I look at a place that, as far as I was concerned, was midway between the port and Guatemala City, and it seemed to me that and a new highway was actually being constructed, and it seemed to me that it made perfect sense for an intermodal facility.
Okay. And if I told you that that same person testified in this proceeding that he was handling 80% of all of Ferrovias' container traffic arriving in Guatemala City, would your opinion about the possibilities in Zacapa change?
Probably not.
Do you know whether the highway was in fact constructed?
I know that I was in a traffic nightmare getting back and forth there in the middle of the evening trying to get back, and it was under construction at the time. Whether or not it's finished, I don't know.
You said you had substantive conversations with Mr. Azurdia. Who introduced you to him?
Let me think for a second. I think he was known by Jorge Sen, but the person that introduced me would be Pablo Alonso, because at the time, I think Jorge was in some kind of court case, and I therefore met him with Pablo.
That's the same Mr. Alonso is seated at council table over to your left.
That is he.
Okay. Now, you said in Exhibit 2 to your first report that Mr. Azurdia was very knowledgeable about properties such as Gerona, Escuintla, Zona 12, and El Rancho. Is that correct?
Yes, we spoke in detail about those.
Okay. And you contrast that, however, with his knowledge of other properties, which you described in Exhibit 2 as, quote, reasonably knowledgeable. That doesn't sound very convincing, Mr. McSwain, does it?
Did I use the word reasonably?
Well, that you made a contrast between Mr. Azurdia's. Mr. Azurdia is your source here, right?
He's one of them.
Okay.
If I may answer, I know something about real estate, I guess, and I know a lot about Boston real estate because I was born and raised, but I might not know as much about Chicago real estate as I do Boston, but that doesn't mean I don't know Chicago real estate.
Okay. Now, Mr. Azurdia talked to you about the properties about which he was very knowledgeable, the 4 properties that were being considered as investment properties. But what did you quote him as saying about them in Exhibit 2 of your report? Can we take a quick look at that? Do you see, sir, in the middle of the 3rd paragraph where he says, quote, it would not be worth the time and money to perform the significant due diligence that would be required?
I see that.
Okay. So he's talking to you about these properties. He hasn't done the significant due diligence on these properties. What significant due diligence did you do on these properties?
I don't think he's saying that at all. If you look and say whether or not the Korean investors would put money into these properties, they would probably be calling for a lot of due diligence as to people to put money into property. That would not necessarily mean that you don't know the value of the property.
Okay. And in fact, if we read this carefully, what he's really saying is that because of the lesivo, it's not worth putting the time and effort in, isn't he?
That's correct. That's
right. Okay. And your task was to determine the value of these properties absent the lesivo, correct?
correct.
Okay. So
I'm not following. I'm sorry.
I think the tribunal can understand.
But I think I should also in order to answer the question.
I didn't ask you a question about that. I just made an observation about it.
Go ahead.
All right. You discussed infrastructure development and or construction financing with Mr. Azurdia according to Exhibit 2, correct?
Correct.
And he said that the Lesivo Declaration, quote, virtually negated, close quote, any possibility to obtain financing, right?
Correct.
But did you discuss with him whether and on what terms financing would have been available absent the Lesivo Declaration?
No. And if you look at the rebuttal report, all of the financing that would have been necessary for land improvements have been removed, and therefore there was not a cause for the need for financing. It was a straight due leasing proposition.
I see. And so none of these properties would have required any kind of development, any kind of investment by the person who was going to rent the property.
That had nothing to do with the financing by the railway.
Well, I don't think we're talking about financing for the railway. We're talking about financing for properties.
No, what we were talking about is FVG's ability to obtain financing for infrastructure development and or construction. It has nothing to do with the people who are going to lease it.
All right. Well, why don't we put up C27D, the annual report of Ferrovias, 2001. If we could go to RDC 001046. Could we please take a look at, sorry here. The second paragraph in the left column,
I see it.
could you read that, please? What does that paragraph say?
These include a lack of available financing in the region for our capital programs and working capital needs, and a similar lack of available financing for potential users.
We've lost the interpretation.
Too fast?
No, we lost the interpretation. Did we get it back? It's okay?
Good.
Read it again, please.
These include a lack of available financing in the region for our capital programs and working capital needs, and a similar lack of available financing for potential users of our right-of-way for projects such as fiber optics.
Thank you. You also mentioned Exhibit 2, your efforts to speak to bankers about possible financing, but reported that they said that a face-to-face meeting would serve no purpose. Is that correct? Back in Exhibit 2?
Correct.
Okay. But what does your report do to address the pre-Lasivo environment?
What does my report?
Yes, the availability of financing in the pre-Lasivo environment.
Well, it seems to me that it was an after-the-fact matter, that when I was there, Lasivo had occurred, and therefore all of my valuations were based upon the inability to obtain financing and pure leasing, and that's why the rebuttal report is issued in the way it was.
Right. But basically, when it comes right down to it, we don't have any real hard evidence. We don't have any affidavits from any people. I don't know if you made some notes on your trip, but we don't have those. All we have are your two reports and not any real documentation about any real possibilities.
You have my two reports, and I have your two reports, which says that there is no value whatsoever in the land in Guatemala.
I think, sir, that our report says there's no evidence of the value, and it's the claimants who have the burden of proof on this issue.
No, I don't think that's accurate. I think that the report says that, for example, there would be no additional longitudinal transactions done on the right-of-way, and it's now filled with them.
Well, why don't we talk a little bit about this, about your projections for the right-of-way income. As of 2006, just prior to the Lasivo, Ferrovias had signed contracts for a total of 72.8 kilometers of right-of-way easements with industrial customers. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
I think that's in paragraph 5 of your second report.
Okay.
Now, in your first report, you assumed that in the year immediately after the Lasivo, that would be 2007, Ferrovias would have been able to fully cover the length of its network. Is that correct, sir?
Which, are we in the rebuttal?
No, in your first report, sir.
And page?
Well, I think we look at section 7 of your report, which begins on page 7. And then if we look at page 9, you've got a little chart under 7.1.5. And there you're assuming, if we look at the top of the chart, 495 kilometers of main lines and 185.4 kilometers of rural spurs.
Correct.
All right. And that leasing starts in 2007, according to the projections that you made.
Correct.
Okay. And back in 7.1.4, on the previous page, page 8, you said in the middle of the paragraph, 7.1.4, that without excluding any of the other possible longitudinal uses listed above, it is reasonable to assume that the two main rights-of-way which stretch from Puerto Barrios to Tecunuman, a total of approximately 495 kilometers, would have had at least one electric transmission and one telecommunication main transmission line on each side of the right-of-way. Is that correct?
That's what it says, sir.
Okay. So you were assuming, or you were projecting, excuse me, that in 2006, when there were 78 kilometers, 72.8 kilometers, that the very next year, the entire system would be leased.
That is basically correct.
Okay. So, in other words, you were assuming an increase, an additional 1,360 kilometers, because you had two lines on every kilometer. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So, from one year to the next, there would be a 1,870% increase in the amount of leases.
And I think that has been altered, has it not, sir, in my rebuttal report?
Oh, I'm not asking you about that yet. We'll get to that. But this is your first report.
Okay.
So that's what you assumed. And then, or what you projected. And then, I believe that the income, which was projected to be generated by this huge increase in kilometers being leased, was $3,168,000. Do you see that? Just from the main lines. Page 9.
I'm getting there. Yes, I see that.
Okay. And you forecast a further 444,960 from rural spurs, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if we add those two amounts together, you're saying that in 2007, Ferrovias would have obtained more than $3.5 million from new contracts.
Yes.
Okay. That's a 3,800% increase in 1 year. Are you aware of that?
Not till you told me.
Okay. You think that's reasonable?
That's why I adjusted my next report.
Okay, so let's talk about your second report.
Okay.
This time you corrected yourself and you introduced a ramp-up period, isn't that so?
Second report, what page, sir?
If we look at page 5 of your second report,
Yep.
now you're forecasting $412,186 of revenues from easements in 2007.
Yes.
Okay. And that itself is a 336% increase compared to the prior year, isn't it?
The prior year being 2006, obviously?
Yes, sir.
And that's 10% occupancy?
That's what you assumed.
Okay.
But the total revenues from leasing the prior year were 94,401.
That is
Okay.
correct. And I was valuing at 10% occupancy on those people who were already there and to legitimize their use of the right-of-way.
Right. And then if we look down at the next line for 2008, the number doubles. Now it's 824,000, so that's a 100% increase in the next year.
20% occupancy?
Yes, sir.
That is how the math works, yes, sir.
Right, and then it doubles again the next year, right?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And for 2009, revenues of $1,648,000.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, what evidence do you have that such a series of increases would have been feasible?
What evidence do I have?
Yes, sir.
Multitudes of pictures that show they're all over the right-of-way.
And you're assuming that every single line that you took a picture of or that someone took a picture of for you would be converted into a paying lease
Why wouldn't it be?
from 1 minute to the next?
Why wouldn't it be? If you're on property that I have and you aren't paying, I think that's a pretty easy negotiation.
And did you consider the fact, Mr. McSwain, that there was the so-called HESUR preliminary agreement that you talked about? Even if we were to assume that that was valid evidence of the potential, that was 32 kilometers, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
It wasn't in the entire system, was it?
No, it wasn't. But I think it says right up here about occupancy, not entire systems, during the ramp-up. And I am going to venture a guess, but I think I'm going to be correct, that my 2011 number is probably low based upon the occupancy that is there now for people who are illegally using the property in use.
Okay. Why don't we put up that map that you were shown on your direct examination? Did you prepare this map, sir?
I did not.
Okay. And who did?
I expect it was via information from Jorge Sen, and I don't know whether the law firm prepared the map or not, but I did not prepare the map.
I see. And do you see any kind of a scale on this map?
No.
Okay. So we don't really know how many kilometers belong to which company or what the
What does that have? I don't understand that question. If they're on the right-of-way, whether they're GASUR or others, they're on the right-of-way.
But you're saying that you know they're on the right of way just because of those pictures, and they're all going to convert.
No, they're not going to convert. They're there. And
There,
if they're there, and you have the use of the right-of-way, normal real estate action to that would be to get off the right-of-way or pay me.
And Ferrovias had been there for 8 years, and they didn't succeed in leasing those properties, did they?
No, they did not. I would expect that they were pretty interested in getting the railway up and running rather than interested in real estate at the time.
And do you have any evidence that these squatters would have stayed if they had to pay $3,200 a kilometer?
Do I have any evidence? Is that your question? I'm sorry, I missed your question. Evidence?
That's right. Do you have any proof that they would have done that? You're just assuming that they would have.
Just common logic that if they're going to spend hundreds of thousands of millions, or maybe even millions of dollars to put something up on your right-of-way, they're not going to take it down.
And some of them have had a free good for at least 8 years, maybe more, right?
Objection. This fact's not in evidence.
He's describing them as squatters.
I'm objecting to the 8 years characterization.
Objection sustained.
Do you know where these pictures were taken or when?
Yes, I think I do. I don't have my stuff in front of me. I think they were taking after my March rebuttal report was submitted and soon thereafter.
We looked earlier at 7.1.4 of your first report where you assumed a new telecom contract for each right-of-way. But Ferrovias's experience was to the contrary, wasn't it? It had secured no telecom contracts.
That is correct.
And in fact, as far back as 2002, Ferrovias had basically recognized that none were coming. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
Can we look at annual report from 2002, C27E? Page 1079.
Okay, I'm there, but go ahead.
Okay, you see a section which begins called right-of-way revenue.
Yes?
Okay. Could you read there what it says? While we had originally
contemplated a market for fiber optics as the prime alternative use of our right-of-way, demand for fiber optics must be considered paralyzed by the recent problems of overcapacity and lack of financing at a global level. Guatemala is undeveloped in this regard, but as a practical matter, few of the companies active in this business in recent years are actively looking at the types of opportunities that we have to offer. Notwithstanding the above, other types of businesses are evolving that similarly depend on the use of an unbroken right-of-way through and between urban areas.
So no, there weren't going to be any fiber optic contracts.
No, but it looks like we're going to have other stuff, though.
Yep, okay. In your first report, you make certain assumptions about the likely evolution of real estate revenues that FEG would have been able to obtain from 2007 onwards, absent the LaCivo. Based on your expertise, you thought the assumptions you made in the first report regarding future revenues were reasonable, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But yet you changed those assumptions significantly in your second report, didn't you?
Obviously, yes.
Okay. So could we put up figure 10 from Dr. Spiller's second report, please? This figure was prepared based on the data you submitted in your first and your second reports related to forecasted right-of-way revenues. Do you see that?
Yes.
The two lines are quite different, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
So they both can't be right, can they?
If they're different, they both can't be right.
Right.
One is better than the other.
Okay. So which one reflects your view on the way the revenues would have evolved?
Well, obviously, the rebuttal.
Okay. And could we take a look at the slope of that dotted line? It's pretty steep, isn't it?
Of course it is. It's because the agreements ran out 2 years before the end of the usufruct, and we decided and it was over. If you look at the years, it's 2042.
Right. No, I'm talking about the slope at the beginning in 2007. And the little demonstrative exhibit that your counsel showed you this morning didn't include the lines to the left of the dotted lines, did it? Which is the past performance of Ferrovias.
I think I have to think that one over for a second. I have to. Can we look at the exhibit that we showed?
We don't have it and we don't control it, so why don't we just move on to another question?
Well, no. Wait a minute. I want to make sure that I don't have it in front of me.
Yeah, well, I think mechanically it's difficult at the moment, so why don't we move on?
I'm sure, hopefully my counsel will be able to show it to me later. Go ahead.
You said that the changes you made in the second report were to make it more conservative. Is that correct?
That is correct.
But does that make it right?
Does that
I'm
make
going to object to the use of the term
What-
right in the context of this testimony. This is expert opinion testimony.
This is expert opinion testimony that what he did was reasonable, and he has to give his views as to what is reasonable.
That's correct, and it's not whether it's right.
But it doesn't depend on whether it's conservative or not conservative. It has to be right.
I believe the standard would be reasonably certain, not right.
If you could rephrase the question.
All right.
I mean,
You now consider your numbers reasonable now that you've had another chance?
I consider my numbers quite reasonable and conservative.
And you changed the number of kilometers of main lines and spurs between one report and the other. On what basis did you make that change?
I made it on the basis of, I obviously had picked up the wrong numbers when I was in Guatemala and on my trip and had 495 kilometers, but it's been proven that it was wrong
And how was it so proven?
by maps and mileposts.
And are any of those in our record?
I couldn't tell you what's in your record, but it certainly is in the records of the railway with regard to its mileposts.
So we don't really have any basis for evaluating either of the sets of numbers, do we?
Oh, I think you can probably take a map and figure out exactly what the mileage is between all of the rights-of-way.
If the map had a scale on it, we could maybe.
Well, I think that you can probably get a map of Guatemala that will have a scale.
We don't have one yet in this record.
Well,
You made another change. You increased short-term annual rental income from $25,000 a year to $125,000 a year.
yes,
Why did you do that?
because it's accurate.
And did you have any evidence to support that change?
Yes, evidence is supplied by the railway.
Let's see.
Yes.
You don't want to pinpoint that for us here today. All right, let's talk about one other thing. Going back to the real estate contracts, I believe that you projected the net present value of total real estate contracts at the 12.9% discount rate that was provided by Dr. Pratt at $40,572,153. There's been some evidence submitted in this case concerning the Jesur extension. We spoke about that. There was some evidence about the Zacapa retail and about the Girona parking lot in the form of some letters. Do you have any idea what percentage of that $40 million are represented by those three pieces of evidence?
No, but I could calculate it.
All right. Well, would you be surprised if I told you it's 5.77%?
No.
Okay, thank you. Just going back to those photographs about the industrial squatters, how do you know that those are pictures along the right-of-way? You can't really tell where the right-of-way is, can you?
Oh, I think we can, yes.
Yeah. All right.
Could I see those pictures that you're referencing?
I think
Could you show him
I
the
guess the
pictures,
final
please?
question is, sorry.
No, well, I mean, if you have a final question.
No, I'm not going to ask him
Okay.
anymore. I just wanted to ask him if he has any information about how long the squatters have been there on these lines.
Some before, most after Lasivo. But again, I want to get back to the pictures because you brought the subject up and proving whether or not these squatters are on the right-of-way, and I think those pictures will evidence that they are. And those
But-
pictures will also evidence that significant amount of the right-of-way is used by those squatters.
But it-
That interfered. And there was a picture that a significant amount of the right-of-way what?
Is occupied by those squatters.
the question is not whether they're there, it's when they got there, and you don't have any information about that.
Wait a minute. They weren't there during one of my visits, and then during my visit, excuse me, and they're there now, so we can pretty well confirm that they have, the great bulk of them have occurred after 2007.
Do we have you said you'd only been to Guatemala once,
That's right.
right? And we don't have before and after pictures.
I don't think that's making any sense to me, sir. In other words, they weren't on the right-of-way when I went from Zacapa down to San Jose, for example, except for the ones that we knew about. The great bulk of them were on the right-of-way after my visit, which was after the Lasivo occurred. So it's obvious that that's when they went on the right-of-way.
Well, in fact, your visit took place after the Lasivo.
And that's when they went on the right-of-way, when they knew they could get away with it.
And you're talking about utility poles that just
Yes.
sprung up like mushrooms post-Lasivo?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. If we could show those pictures, that maybe they would be. And it happened, the great bulk of it happened post-Lasivo.
Well,
Could you,
I think I'm finished.
I know you are finished and you are out of time, and you said it was your last question, but since the issue of the pictures now has come up, I think the tribunal would appreciate seeing the pictures on our own time, if necessary.
I'm sure that Mr. Stern will take care of that in his redirect.
Mr. Stern.
Thank you. And just to get to your question or your request, up on the screens here, Mr. McSwain, which is Annex 3 to the third statement of Mr. Sen. Is it your understanding that these were photographs that were taken by Mr. Sen when he traveled the right-of-way at your request in the winter and spring of 2011?
That is correct, sir.
Okay. And is it your understanding that these are photographs of the right-of-way?
Yes, they are.
And is it your understanding that these photographs show power lines present throughout the right-of-way, based on what these pictures show?
Yes, sir.
And is it also your understanding
This
that
is,
these...
I'm sorry.
sorry, if you have...
That was, the last picture was a perfect example of it. And
Which one are you referring to?
Next one up, right there. I mean, you can see the right-of-way, and that's, and the track, I mean, that is in the right-of-way. There's no doubt about it.
And in other pictures, you don't see railway track, but is it your understanding that that is, there might be a road or some other cleared path? Is it your understanding that
That is correct.
the right-of-way on the unrestored portions of the railway?
It's my understanding that many of the rail track have been taken up, and then, but these utility poles are on what was the active right-of-way and no longer being used by rail because the rail's gone.
Okay, thank you. Let me just ask a few additional questions. Mr. Debevoise asked you questions about the short-term rental amounts that you revised in your rebuttal report. Do you recall questions about that?
Yes, sir.
Is it your understanding that Dr. Spiller agrees with the revised valuations that you used in your rebuttal report?
Yes, I think that Dr. Spiller agrees with the existing agreements and the rental and the short-term rentals.
And do you recall being asked some questions about whether telecom or fiber optic companies were interested in utilizing the right-of-way?
Yes, I do recall the question.
Let me ask you this, based on your experience and expertise, from a valuation, a real estate valuation perspective, does it make a difference whether the right-of-way easement user is a telecom company, a power company, a gas company, or any other type of utility?
Not necessarily. It would be. It's pretty well all the same with regard to the monetary remuneration.
You were asked some questions about the properties, the real estate station yards, and the station leases that were including in your valuation. You recall questions about that?
Yes.
When your trip to Guatemala in August of 2007, did you visit all of the properties that you valued in your report?
That I evaluated, yes. Except, is Tecunuman in there? And it's not in my valuation, is it? No. The ones that I saw, I valued.
Just make sure. And just for the record, I believe there's a Tecunuman station in your.
I don't know.
Yes, there is a Tecunuman valuation. Other than Tecunuman,
Other than Tecunuman, yes. Because I did not get there.
I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stern.
I want to have a clear understanding of how much of the south coast line you traversed.
I need to see a map, sir. Let me take a quick look. Do I have one? Oh, okay. I gotta zoom in on. Right, yeah. Yep. A little further to the left. Yep. Right there, that's right there. I don't know how to pronounce it. Retalhuleu. I don't know how to pronounce the word. But I didn't get any further than that. I didn't get over to, heading over to. Yeah. Okay.
With respect to comparing Guatemala and Boston and other places in the U.S., the valuations that you have given the tribunal, they're based on your discussions with local real estate people and also on actual revenues that were generated, or I want to make sure that we have a clear understanding that we're dealing with Guatemalan values and how exactly you arrived at those.
No, they're all based upon conversations with Guatemalan people. And the value of Chicamula, I would need to talk to somebody to find out whether or not Chicamula was worth $1 or $10 a foot. The piece of the big part of my valuation was based upon the last contract that was about to be executed for the easement for Gasur, that set the bar, so to speak, for the valuation of the main. It was a lot of people were able to give you evaluations for Guatemala City and Sonora, et cetera, et cetera. But as you got into more rural, you got the conversations they had and you can see some of my valuations, sir, are pretty low in some of those towns. For example, if I can get there we go. You look at some of the smaller places, and you looked at the numbers, are $28,000 a year, and et cetera, for rent. So those I had to count on the people that I discussed the valuations with, but mostly were people who were located and operated out of Guatemala City, to be factual.
And the Gasur contract, or potential contract, was never actually effectuated. That was a key litmus test for you?
Yes, because we were at the 11th hour to execute a contract. It was, that was definitely what I would say the standard. The last deal, normally it's the last deal done, it sets the standard. This was the last deal that was almost done because they backed out because of Lesivo.
And was that value consistent with what you had heard from other experts?
It was a value that is ready to be executed by Gasur and FEG.
How much of the Phase 1 northern line did you traverse?
That all the way up to Zacapa, did not get to Puerto Barrios.
Do you have a greater degree of confidence in your valuations and estimates for that line since it was completed and you traversed it than you do for the south coast where you traversed only a portion of it?
I'd have to answer that in two parts. One, I have a greater degree of confidence with regard to the yards and stations valuations, but with regard to the right-of-way longitudinal easements, I don't think that would make a difference between whether it was the north or the southern line.
I know you're not a legal expert, and it's not on that basis that you're testifying. So let me just give you an assumption, and that is that the Lesivo Declaration was issued with respect to a set of contracts that we call 143 and 158, which dealt with the rental of rolling stock. The contract 402, which I think you've reviewed, is a contract which gives the railroad the opportunity to develop the right-of-way. Is that your understanding?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
The Lesivo Declaration was not, I would ask you to assume, issued with respect to that contract, 402.
I was of the impression that my assignment by a client was to value all of our real estate yards and rights of way, is to find out what we would have generated in income without a Lesivo decree.
Would it affect your judgment if you understood that the railroad continued to have rights under 402 to lease property, that is to say it was unaffected by the Lesivo as a legal matter?
I don't think so. I don't think so, sir.
And can you explain that, why?
I think that if I understand your question properly, I think that the railroad's, oh, I'm sorry, sir, the railroad's ability to, I guess if you're asking me, if the railroad lost its ability to lease the property to,
Well, if it still retained its ability to lease.
it's still retained, that, to me, that would be how I did value the property, that it did retain its ability to lease, and would have it for the remainder of 42 years from, which is how I projected our numbers.
And do you know, I mean, you were using an almost completed contract, the Gasur. Do you know from your own time in the country and from your discussions with experts why it might have been that the railroad didn't continue to try to lease property on the right-of-way?
I don't have the answer to that, other than I think that the real reason that I would give is that it seems as though they were absolutely using up every bit of their energy and personnel to try to get the railroad to operate.
Well, I'm talking about after 2007 when they left to now.
No, I don't have an answer to that.
And you mentioned that it was not necessary to have an operating railroad to be able to come to these valuations.
For the most part, yes. If, in fact, there are pieces of my analysis that would call for a railway operation, like the intermodal facility in Zacapa. Now, but for the right-of-way, it wouldn't matter whether, in fact, power companies, as is evidence, would prefer you don't have a railway.
Right. No, I think there are two. I understand there are two pieces to this. For the right-of-way, the least obstruction, the better for transmission lines and so forth, and that I understand. But for industrial squatters, would it not make a difference if they were close to an operating railroad in order to be able to ship their product, or
if there were, as you read through the report, if there are sections that call for warehousing, etc., the likelihood of an active railway would in fact make the property more valuable. Not necessarily that it would have no value, because it's still, as long as there's highway and trucking ability, you can have warehouses. But for intermodal purposes and for Maersk refrigerated storage, it probably would have more value if I had an operating railway.
Now, I know that you mentioned that there were very few industrial squatters when you came down in 2007, and you've testified that there's been a profusion of those since. From the pictures that you got from Mr. Sen, your discussions with Mr. Sen, or in other ways, can you give the tribunal an idea of what types of industrial squatters they are? Are these major facilities, manor facilities, somebody who puts up a little store and becomes an industrial squatter? When you use that term, what are we really talking about?
You and I have the same problem when I first went down there. Industrial squatters to me meant basically you had buildings that were put on your right-of-way, etc., and there are some instances of that. The people in Guatemala refer to industrial squatters as, in fact, utility easement squatters. They're an industry that supplies electricity. They refer to them. There are instances in some of the pictures you'll see where you have buildings and others that are obviously on the right-of-way. And you have tons of, don't let me use that phrase, lots of squatters who are in fact people who are occupying railway buildings that used to be and are now being used for residences. But industrial squatters to them, for the most part, means like Gasur, who was not a squatter, but utility companies.
So these aren't, I mean, I'm just trying to put this in in a perspective we can all understand. These are not what we would call greenfield developments where somebody, since 2007, has built a new facility, or indeed, are they?
There are a couple of instances that has happened, yes. I think that a couple of the pictures will show, if you could put it back up, and we'll give you an instance where that warehouse was on, let me see, we keep going. If you go back a few, you'll see these, some of those extensions and buildings, things were built out since 2007 on, like that platform that was built out there. But for the most part, there's one that has a warehouse right built on we can find it.
Do we have any idea of the sort of square footage if you combined all of these industrial squatters? Do we have any idea of what sort of total square footage we're talking about?
I really don't, but if you glance at the one there on the screen now, you'll see what that building is new.
But we don't.
I don't have.
We don't know how many and what their square footage is.
No, I don't, sir.
In your first statement at page 6.0, pre-Lesivo industrial squatters, you mention, unlike individual squatters, most of whom are impoverished, industrial squatters are illegal trespassers who could afford to pay rent but have failed to do so because of FEGWA's inaction. The inaction you're referring to, is that not removing the squatters?
Yes, or going to force them to pay for the use of the property.
How do you know they could afford to pay rent?
I'm sorry?
How do you know that they could indeed afford to pay rent?
Some of the companies I've listed here are actual electrical companies. I don't know how to pronounce, but INDE is, and the Municipal Egisa, those are all, and Diorsa are in fact transmission companies. They're companies who sell electricity. So I would expect they have the ability to pay rent for the use of property.
But we don't know what percentage could pay, or what percentage are just there because it's free, and if rent was going to be required, might not be able to stay.
We don't know exactly, but I think when you look at the list of the ones that are shown on the pictures, those are in fact large electrical transmission companies in Guatemala, who they kind of do their area by zones.
Okay, let me just ask you one last question. If we can go back to what was described, I think, by Mr. Debevoise as figure 10, Spiller 2, figure X. I don't know if that gives you enough. These were my rough notes. I think it was described by Mr. Debevoise as figure 10. The second Spiller report, it was that chart, the green.
I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to look at yeah, I understand. Right. Okay, so there are two sets of questions, well, three sets. One is simply that you extended out in your rebuttal the term of the revenues.
I did, and the reason I did that is that I figured that if they're already there,
Right.
and we're going to run through the 2048.
Right. It's just not going to drop off the
That's
cliff.
correct.
Okay.
which is what the first one did. It did drop
I
off.
understand. Okay, the second issue is that the curve, starting in around 2020 or so, in your rebuttal goes up quite considerably faster in terms of revenues than in your first. Could you explain what assumptions you made that would have resulted in that?
I think that I ran out of the vacancy. I felt comfortable that the vacancy would no longer be applicable around that period of time, and therefore the right-of-way would be basically full. And therefore here, on the first one, I didn't do that. But when I came to right around 2018, we were now at 100% occupancy, so to speak, and therefore that causes the spike that continues between the rebuttal and the first.
So in other words, you're assuming about 100% occupancy in the rebuttal.
As we get into a further period of time,
Right.
to show you, excuse me. Yes, what I did is basically did a ramp-up period where it was only starting in 2007 was a 10%, then 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60% to 2011 occupancy. Then beginning in 2012, I had a 20% vacancy, and then I shrunk it after 5 years to a 15% vacancy, and then after that, you're basically full, which is because
Okay. Then the third and last question I have is to compare those projections with actual performance. So between 2000 and 2006, this is pre-Lasivo, the actual revenues were fairly modest. Do you have a sense of why they were? And then the second part of the question is, what assumptions, I understand technically what assumptions you made, but why would one assume that suddenly you would get this big ramp up after 2006 when they didn't get that from 2000 to 2006?
I would say that the real reason is that they did not work very hard at accomplishing that between 2000 and 2006. They were devoted to and dedicating their time to operating a railroad which was experiencing much more problems, I'm told, than they ever expected they were going to deal with. And so they used their personnel for railway purposes only. I do believe that what was needed here was somebody or some people who were going to dedicate their time to the real estate development and the easement development.
But they had 6 years to do it, and they didn't evidently do it.
I just think that they spent their time with the railway rather than trying to work this thing.
Because there's been other testimony that one of the reasons why RDC wanted to bid on this contract to begin with was that they expected the revenue from leasing of property, easements, etc., to far exceed that from the railway. So given that, wouldn't one assume reasonably that you could talk and chew gum at the same time, particularly when the real value was in these leases?
I have to admit that they probably needed to be a heck of a lot more aggressive than they were in the early stages. because I believe as you look at what has occurred with regard to at least the longitudinal stuff, it's there. I mean, they could have and should have capitalized on it faster. But I think their time frame was more dedicated to, and I'm told that the funds that they were supposed to be receiving didn't come their way as expected with regard to, is it FEGWA? Is it FEGWA? They weren't getting the funds out of FEGWA that they expected to get to.
Okay, then looked at the other way, however, since 2007, without anybody being there, you've got this profusion of use of the right-of-way with transmission lines and so forth. Is that your understanding?
It is my understanding, sir. Yes.
And this is typical from your railway experience of what happens along railway right-of-lands, rights-of-way.
It's very common in almost the great bulk of railway rights-of-way, that they contain transmission lines, gas lines, telecommunication lines, cell towers, etc.
And how much different do you think that might be with a developing country like Guatemala versus other places that
I don't think it would be different with regard to the need and the growth because of electrical transmission. I do believe that I probably erred with the telecommunications in the first report, why it was removed in the second report. But I believe that when a country has, answer a different way, in order for the country to develop, they're going to need electricity and gas, and the easiest place to do it is on railway right-of-way.
And that's because you don't have to acquire any property, you don't have to remove anybody.
You don't have to cut trees, you don't have to, the construction is of ease because normally, you go on either side of the right-of-way from where the train runs, and it's an ease of construction.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Professor Crawford has some questions.
My colleague, Secretary Eisenstadt, has covered on his third point the main question I wanted to ask, but I'd just like to take it a bit further. Is it true that the essential reason why the performance in the non-railway aspects of the enterprise, essentially there were the people who are represented by the low figure are people who are essentially wanting a free ride? Isn't that right? They're parking their cars or setting up their enterprises and not being charged. And you're making an assumption that within a very short period of time, I'm putting this as a question, in a very short period of time, you're going to be able to get 100% recovery from people whose basic existence depends upon they're not paying rents, they're not being licensed, they're not being part of a rule of law economy. Is that an unfair remark?
I think slightly, sir. There's a brand new courthouse there. I think that people are going to go there, and if you can park for free, you can park for free. But a lot of those cars that are there are in fact attorneys and et cetera who are going to the courthouse. And if you had safe, secure parking, and I know where you're coming at, but I do believe that they would also pay. If you can get away for free, you get away for free, but I think they'd pay.
Graphic, if it was realizable in the context of Guatemala, surely would be realized by the right holders, whoever the right holders are. I mean, there's a very significant potential there for income, but it's a pure hypothesis.
I guess that it has to be tempered with some, it's a hypothesis, it's tempered with a piece of realism that says it's loaded with cars. If you were to fence it off and make them come in to pay, the assumption has to be that there's other places they can go for free, but it won't be next to the courthouse.
How long were you in Guatemala?
About a week.
Thank you. No further questions.
Just to follow up on Professor Crawford's question, should the tribunal, in looking at this issue, distinguish between the industrial users, the so-called industrial squatters, where you do get the question of whether how many would stay if they actually had to pay? I mean, obviously, a couple of those have built major facilities. They're not going to, but many of them perhaps are there, as the professor said, for a free ride, and that was implying as well in my question that many are there because they don't have to pay. We don't know how many would stay if they had to pay, certainly if they had to pay at the rates you were assuming. Should we distinguish between that set of potential revenues and those from transmission lines where you already have immovable investments, poles and so forth? Is one more certain than the other in terms of revenues? And
yeah, the transmission lines have got significant investment into those poles and wires now. So one would be much more immovable, one, and two, really would have to pay. It would cost them more to take down the stuff, number one, and number two, lose a system while they're doing it. So that would be more certain by a lot. Then you have some instances of, like the warehouse that you saw. That's pretty certain. There are others that somebody may just tell you, go pound sand. And I don't know what the percentage is, but some will definitely tell you to do that. Then you need the following thing to happen. And that is that, as I understand it, and I'm not the legal guy, that the government was supposed to help remove those people who wouldn't pay or were illegally there.
And again, it's beyond your mandate to know why the railway isn't today, December 2011, collecting revenues from the transmission lines. And
no, I think that after Lasivo, nobody's going to pay anyway, I don't think. Who are they going to pay?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McSwain.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Mr.
Thank you. Mr. McSwain, could you go to paragraph, or your second rebuttal report, and I want to focus on starting on paragraph 9. I just want, in response to some of the questions from Secretary Eisenstadt, just to make clear, and in showing figure 10 from Dr. Spiller's second report, just so they have a full understanding as to what were the differences between your original easement valuations versus your second.
Where were you again on the...
I'm on paragraph 9 of your rebuttal report.
Okay. Now I have got my pages mixed up, I think. What page is it? Because I definitely...
You have your rebuttal?
Yeah, I
I'm
got
sorry,
my
page 4, in your rebuttal report, not your original report.
Yeah, I know. I've screwed them up.
All right, well, maybe we can just look on the screen here and go from there.
Oh, okay.
So in paragraph 9, you discuss some adjustments you made on your easement valuations from your original report, right?
Yes.
And one of the adjustments you made was based upon learning new information or revised information about the distances of the main line and the rural spurs on the right-of-way?
That is correct.
And did that have the effect of increasing the distances for both segments?
Oh, yes. Yes.
And as a result of that, did that cause some of your have effect in increasing some of your easement valuation?
Yes, it does, and it's one of the reasons that in the chart you saw, the climb occurred right from the very start. We had 495 to 644 is a pretty significant number.
Okay, and then in paragraph 10 in the chart that follows on your rebuttal report, you discuss some adjustment you made on the vacancies for the vacancy rates for the easements.
Yes, I got to see it. Here we go. Yes.
And did those adjustments have the effect of making your valuations more conservative?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, if you take the 10-20 through 60% through 2011, and then even in 2012, you're still 20% vacant. Of course it does.
And just so the record's clear, in the year 2007, you were assuming that only 10% of the entire main line would have been would have right-of-way easements,
That is a correct statement.
and then you do a ramp up from that point forward, 20, 40, 50, 60% in the next 4 years.
That is correct, and it's why I made the statement that, the possibility exists. I know, don't laugh at me, but the possibility exists that my number might be low because of the squatters that are on there now, if they were monetized.
Now, I just want to also get clear as to the components of your valuation, since there were questions asked about, whether the station yard leases versus the easements, and which are more important in effect. Could you go to his demonstrative exhibit? Now, as this demonstrative exhibit shows, could you describe, versus the additional station yard leases and the right-of-way easements, how do they account, in terms of the valuations that you did?
Oh, you can see that the right-of-way leases
Closer to the mic.
excuse me, the right-of-way, bad back. The right-of-way leases are a significant part of the valuation, without any question of a doubt. And the pre-existing, especially the Cabigua, which has made the spike on the pre-existing, and then all the other real estate really is generated basically, if you look at the report closely, out of probably 5 or 6 properties has caused the valuation.
And on the right-of-way leases, is the ramp-up period that you did, is it based upon the information that you have been provided by Mr. Sen when he traveled the right-of-way?
Actually, no. We took the made the analysis, was filed, and then Mr. Sen went on the right-of-way, and that's why I keep saying I might have been too conservative as far as the right-of-way is concerned, because if you're able to legalize and monetize what presently exists, my numbers in 2012, 11 are probably low, if you were able to do that.
Okay, now, I just want to get one more thing clear on the record on the question of industrial squatters. If you could go back to the map. Now, the term industrial squatters, as used in this map, and I think also in your reports as well, are you referring to warehouse facilities or properties or buildings, or are you referring to power lines?
Power lines.
And so, in the context of discussing, how you would have monetized the industrial squatters in your analysis, are you referring to the right-of-way easements?
Yes, absolutely, entirely the right-of-way easement.
And is it your understanding this map only is the purpose of this map is to show the depiction of power lines as industrial squatters?
Yes.
Okay, I have nothing further.
Mr. De Beauvois on the tribunal questions.
Mr. McSwain, you just told the tribunal that after Lesivo, nobody is going to pay anyway, right?
Well, they don't have to.
Right. But Ferrovias has continued to collect rents from entities that occupied the right-of-way prior to the Lesivo.
Correct.
And they continue to collect those rents, so why are they continuing to pay?
I think they're afraid that any cancellation of the agreement, as I understand it, Gesur, for example, is continuing to pay. I can't give you the rationale of why they are, but they are. But there are lots that aren't.
And I think you indicated in your report in paragraph 5, this being your second report, no, excuse me. Yes, your second report, that it's quite reasonable to assume that had the Lesivo not occurred, Ferrovias would have taken steps to either legalize the industrial squatters by entering into long-term easement agreements with them, or Ferrovias would have had them evicted or other utilities would have taken their place. But once again, that has not happened, has it?
Obviously not.
And some of the squatters have been there since 1994, even before Ferrovias came.
Yes.
Right. And they've not been evicted.
I think, don't you need government help to evict? I don't know how that works, but I can understand that if you, in order to evict, you're going to have to, I assume, need police or government to do it.
Right.
And that didn't seem to be forthcoming.
Did it occur to you that any of the companies might be owned by the government?
No, didn't occur to me at all.
Did it occur to you
Does that have anything to do with not paying?
Did it occur to you that some of the companies might not be licensed to engage in the distribution business and might be unwilling to come forward in a formal way?
No, that didn't occur to me at all. I assume that if that's the case, then it seems that the government isn't doing their job properly.
Well, that wasn't your issue. You were trying to value. Now, you had a question about from Secretary Eisenstadt about the increase after 2020. Were you aware that the Cobigua lease has a term on it?
Yes.
And what did you assume about that lease?
That lease in 2015 increases to 4% of the revenue.
Right.
Yeah.
And it ends in 2015.
Not the way that I read it.
Well,
I think, where does it say that it terminates in 2015? It increases to 4% of the revenue in 2015, as I read it.
I believe that it increases before 2015 and it terminates in 2015.
I did not read it that way, and I'd have to see that to understand it. And I do believe that it's 2014 that it increases rather than 15.
But more importantly, because I'm not allowed to have a lot of time for these questions, were you aware that that lease is with Fegua, not with Ferrovias?
Why, assumed that it was transferable from Figueroa.
So you assumed that. You assumed that Ferrovias would take it over.
They gave it to her, didn't they? Why would Cobigua be paying FVG?
Well, the question might be is whether it's in the concession or not. You see, there are a
Well, now
number
you
of
get back
angles.
to legal matter, but they have been paying FVG, and in 2014 or 15, they're going to pay them a very considerable amount of money, and I didn't see where there's any termination.
Okay. One final thing, there was a lot of talk about the Hesur contract, and I believe you and Dr. Spiller had a little discussion about the Hesur contract, right?
I've never talked to Dr. Spiller in my life.
I mean, I meant in your
okay.
reports,
All right.
back and forth about the
right.
subject. And I believe that he used a figure of $3,200 per kilometer as the price for the preliminary agreement between Ferrovias and Hesur for that 32-kilometer extension, correct?
Yes.
And you said something about you never saw anything less than $5,000 per mile, right?
That was in the United States, correct?
Right.
But I did say this deal set the bar for our railway dealing with electrical transmission.
Right. But 1 mile is approximately 1.61 kilometers, right? So $5,000 per mile is $3,107 per kilometer, right?
I think that they were paying, I have the opinion they were paying $3,200.
Per kilometer. Per mile.
But my calculations are based upon 644 kilometers at $3,200 per kilometer.
Right, and in the U.S., it's the same, right?
It had nothing to do with the U.S.
All right,
Yeah,
I
I guess
think the point's been made. The tribunal can read the back and forth between the two of you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. There
Thank
are
you.
no further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Appreciate it.
Mr. Metzrein. You can leave.
I was just going to say that because of Dr. Pratt's health, he's in a wheelchair, and it takes some time to move him around and get him here. If we could have our break now, and we'll begin the work of getting Dr. Pratt here.
It is time for a break, no matter what. I think, but I appreciate that. Before we break, you had asked us what does the tribunal need, because we had met with various people from both teams in terms of what the tribunal requirements are for after the hearing in terms of documentation, and I have consulted with my colleagues, and we would appreciate receiving one USB key with all the documentation of the case, with a chronological index with hyperlinks to the documentation. That's one item. The second item is we would like to have a hard copy joint bundle, but only of the documents that have been used in the hearing, and also with a chronological index in hard copy of those documents and organized chronologically. And that we would appreciate to receive in A5, even if it's a small size and a small print. So those are the two things we would like to have. I know I mentioned to the staff we had met before that probably we wouldn't require the A5. It was my original request, but I had to come back on what I said on this after consulting with my colleagues.
Could I ask one question?
Mr. Orta had raised the hand first, so Mr. Orta.
I beat you to the punch, Alan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question on the last request, which was, as I understood it, a compilation of only those documents that have been used at the hearing in A5 format. Do we have any liberty to include, in a very limited way, additional documents that we think are important for the tribunal's consideration? Why do I ask that? Because, for example, there are a number of, I think, key witnesses that the respondent put forward on the issue of the Lesivo declaration that the other side chose not to cross-examine, and as a result, during the hearing, there has not been references to the documents associated with those witnesses, but they are witnesses that we believe are quite important for the tribunal to have at their ready when they're assessing the case. So the question is, are we at liberty to include some of those additional documents in the A5 bundle?
The answer, let my colleagues tell me, of course, but I don't know what your question is.
Well, that was my question was a little bit more general, but covers the same issue that Mr. Orta has. My question was, I am assuming that used at the hearing means documents that are attached to witness statements as well as documents that are physically exhibited or discussed at the hearing. And that would, of course, take care of David's situation as well.
Actually, my
Well,
request
not
is a bit
fully,
broader.
not
Yeah.
fully, because you're
Right.
talking about witness statements for witnesses we haven't seen, but you want us to review their statements, and so
That's correct,
that
Secretary.
that certainly should be part of it. I mean, you would be selective as to what you wanted.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, yes, I have no problem with that at all. I considered that all witness statements, whether they were physically, whether they were cross-examined or not, would be part of the proceeding.
I think the answer to your questions is yes. We would appreciate to have those documents. As I said, we appreciate to have them in A5 size, those, and particularly it's important that be together, if the two parties can put them together, and in chronological order with a hard copy index. So we may all have a break now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, I forgot to say something which is important in terms of coming back. When do we come back? How much time do you need yourself for the expert?
Can we shoot for 11:30?
Okay. So at 11:30 we will resume. Thank you.